Hello and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Tips for the Transition, the Career Roadmap. I'm Maria Tomas Keegan, and I created this show to share resources that help women navigate career and life challenges and to know they're not alone. So each week, my guest and I co create a show to encourage women to be more confident, resilient, and brave in their careers and their lives. So, if you're inspired by something you hear today and you want more of the same, please subscribe, share, comment, tell us how you feel about it, and be sure to check out the show notes below for ways to connect with my guest and me. Now, in this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into a subject that I'm very passionate about transition. I am thrilled to introduce my guest, Linda Rossetti, whose impactful books about transition have revolutionized my perspective and transformed my clients' experience. Through her insightful research for her books Dancing with Disruption and Women and Transition, Linda enables us to see our own transitions through a fresh and invigorating lens. Linda is a business leader, a Harvard MBA, and a pioneering research dedicated to exploring the intricate dynamics of transition. Her passion lies in fostering new conversations, just like this one, that delve into how we respond to and navigate change in our careers and our lives. With her expertise, Linda creates a space where transformation becomes an empowering and an enlightening journey. After undergoing a life altering disruption over 10 years ago, Linda channeled her wisdom and knowledge toward enhancing our comprehension of personal and organizational transformation. So I'd love to just jump right in and get started because we have a lot to cover and time is going to fly by. Welcome, Linda. Thank you so much for joining us.
Maria, thank you. And thank you for creating the opportunity for this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it.
I am too, since I read your book, especially, and I read your first book. I am just so honored that you would come here and chat with us about this topic that we are both very passionate about.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. And I really love the work that you do with your clients. So I'm cheering for you and all those who work with you. And so, yes, I'm looking forward to getting underway.
Yeah, let's do that. All right. So tell us, why did you write this book called Dancing with Disruption?
Well, Maria, it's a lovely question to give me because it really is a reflection of nearly 10 years of research that I did. I spent time sitting down talking with women, largely, and some men about what happened at the times when they experienced a shift in how they thought about themselves. And it could happen in a lot of ways, which I know we'll go into. But it was fascinating the patterns that I saw in the research that I did. Because sitting with nearly 300 people in the research, I found that one, we lack the vocabulary and understanding for what's happening at those times, really at a really substantive level. And I also saw that people who were willing to create a new conversation about what was occurring more often than not created a positive inflection point in their lives. And so I wrote Dancing with Disruption to try to bring fresh thinking to something that, by the way, is universal in our experience, even though we're really taught in our society to kind of tamp down or run the other way when we have these shifts or these thoughts about radical change. And bring not only new thinking to it, but also inspire people to take action because there's real benefit to those who are willing to think differently and respond in a new way to these, transformative opportunities in our lives.
I love that. I love when you said we don't have the words to express what we're going through. I remember that oh so well myself, and the women I work with now often come to me and say, I don't even know how to explain what I'm thinking and feeling, right? And giving um, the vocabulary to use is so important, because when we can express how we're feeling, not only do we then create community with people who are feeling the same thing, and then that's really when we know we're not alone, right? Because there are other
Absolutely.
people who feel the same thing.
It's so interesting you pick up on this point, Maria, because it's one of the most fascinating things that I realized, not only from my own experience, but from sitting with all these other people. Without the vocabulary, there's no way that we can place our experience in a broader context, right? So without that context, very often we turn inward, right? We get this feeling of, oh, it's only happening to me. There must be something wrong with me. I have a significant flaw. I have a deficit, whatever it is. We go inside. And it's the exact opposite of what we need to do with these very generative times in our lives, when there's really a growth invitation hanging out there, even though we might throw it in the recycle bin before even opening it, right? There's these incredible moments. And so my first learning, and part of the reason why I do the work that I do, is that if we lack that context, right, that ability to understand with new vocabulary and be able to kind of place our lived experience within that new understanding, we're in a different spot, right? But if we're able to do that, right, if we can give ourselves kind of a new platform and a lens through which we can see our experience, we can place it, in a context that takes what is fearful, because, oh my goodness, I don't know what's going on, and it completely diffuses the emotions around it and says, hey, wait a minute, it shifts the power back to us, instead of kind of yielding the power to kind of this amorphous kind of, oh my goodness, I don't know what's going on. I don't even have the words to describe it.
Right. And
And it's so it's
along with that comes fear of the unknown, right?
absolutely,
Yeah.
I've in tandem with doing my own research, right? That's primary research where I sat down with other people. I also did what's called secondary research, which is I went and sat down and looked at all of the academic research that touches this area, right? Because I'm a business person. I wanted to have a way to interpret what I was hearing from these people. And so I got to know the work of some wonderful thinkers, Carol Gilligan, Jack Mesereau, Robert Keegan. These are researchers who have spent decades looking at human development. And this one gentleman, Jack Mesereau, who's fantastic, he's now deceased, but did wonderful work at Columbia University for many years. He observed that, in fact, when we're going through these periods of major shifts in our lives, there are actually two tracks of things that we need to be aware of. The first is on a very practical level. If we lose a job and need to replace income, right? Very practical steps we need to take. But he also cautioned that if we ignored the other level, which is learning how to respond differently to the intense emotional reaction that happens, then we'll be kind of, left swimming upstream, without any life support. He's just like, look, if we only deal with the practical, we're doing ourselves a disservice, because when we have a moment where our sense of self becomes unstable for some reason, can be for 1,000 different reasons, what happens is we have this incredible emotional mobilization, right? Our emotions mobilize to try to keep us safe. And needing to navigate that in a new way is a non-negotiable as we kind of navigate these
Hmm.
times. And so this notion of fear or feeling alone and 1,000 other fears that we can talk about, or emotions that we can talk about, are really part and parcel to this experience of navigating what I call a disruption. And it's part of our success toolkit, is really learning to be with these emotions in a new way.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Emotions need motion, right? So if
Yes,
we
I
don't give
love that.
them the motion they need, yeah, they can really disrupt us more than the disruption itself. All right, so let's hear what this book is all about.
Absolutely. And so Dancing with Disruption came out this May, so it's a very new book, and I thank you for giving it some time. It first of all talks about disruption, and I define them very specifically for the book, right? Disruption in this work has to do with shifts or breaks that we encounter in the way we think about ourselves, our self concept, our identity. So, the disruption that's handled in the book is when we, for whatever reason, encounter a break in our thinking about who we are, right? It can happen when we have an unexpected layoff. It can happen when there's a loss in our family. It can happen when there's a geographic move. It can happen 1,000 different ways. So we don't spend so much time in the book um, categorizing the ways. What we do is we say we welcome all of those ways, and we start with, okay, this notion of disruption. And then the book spends probably half of the book talking a little bit about bringing some new thinking to what's really occurring when disruptions occur in our lives. And it's a fascinating look, all told through stories of other individuals who have navigated these same circumstances from all walks of life. So the first half of the book really anchors us on what's happening about disruption. And the second half of the book introduces these techniques that emerged out of a subset of my research, right? I sat down with nearly 300 people to learn about their experience at moments of transition. And then I took 80 of them and had them work with me repetitively through a series of activities, all designed to help walk right next to someone as they were navigating a transition. And so the exercises in the back half of the book are all designed to take someone who, for whatever reason, gets deposited this moment of feeling that, wait a minute, I don't know who I am anymore, or I don't know what to do, and allows them to walk forward in very granular ways so that they can begin to make progress on moving forward. And, the entire book operates as this selection of stories, all from people who participated in my research. But my desire is to do the two things we've already talked about. One is to give people that new understanding of what's happening so that when something unusual kind of breaks our sense of self, we can place our experience within a context, right? Within new understanding. So immediately the fear begins to come down. And then it kind of gives us a roadmap on how we need to walk forward as we begin to move forward in a place where we're saying, you know what? There's more here for me, right? Because my research has kind of validated that when we get to these moments where there's a shift in our thinking about who we are or how we make meaning in the world, they typically are signals that there is a moment of expansion and growth. And the book is really designed to give people the tools to take advantage of that growth and to realize the enormous power. And I don't mean like beat your chest power, right? But the empowering, affirmative, expansive way to go forward from moments of uncertainty.
I love what you did in your book. The stories are so powerful. We're going to talk about a few of those later. But you did something very similar to what I did in my book too. It's give them all of the information, the research, the whys, and then give them the tools so that they can start on the road to healing or changing, transitioning, and giving them the tools is where that's where you put the power in their hands. And I'm so grateful that you did that. And it is an amazing book, all of you. So you need to get it and you need to read through these stories because if nothing else, you're going to read a story and go, oh, I'm not the only one who felt that. I did that countless times through this book. And I teach some of the stuff that Linda does, and we still go through transitions, all of us.
Well,
So,
Maria, it's a wonderful point you bring up because very often we think the transition is episodic. It's like, oh, I'm just going to get through this.
mm,
When I learned really events can be a part of our experience of transition, right? That, we can have a layoff or a reorg at work or what have you that really leaves us in this very unstable place. But the one common denominator that goes through, and the only one common denominator that goes through all transitions, is this notion of turning up the volume on our own voices. And once we begin that process, it is an iterative, expansive route for the rest of our lives. Right. Very often we think the transition is the event. It's, oh, the remarriage, oh, the divorce, oh, the geographic move, oh, welcoming another child, what have you. And I learned that while those things can be a part of our transitions, the thing that really is happening in our transition is we're trying to connect in a new way to our own truth. And when I say voice, right, I use the word voice, but when I use it, I mean our essence, our truth, the things that really are unique to us. And it really transition is really this growth pattern that allows us to get closer and closer to what those things are. Because, oh, by the way, in the normal course, we are very often get decoupled from those things,
Yeah.
not for any fault of our own, but we do. And so it's this pathway through this recentering on the things that really are important to us, that make us tick, and then giving ourselves the runway to turn up the volume, to let other people experience that in us. And that's really the beauty of transition. And once we begin that path, it happens again and again and again. I
Right.
remember one woman who was in my research, she said, I feel like it's now just a part of my body chemistry, right? It just, it is just who I am now. And it
Right.
wasn't in the beginning, right? It was a
Right.
learned place. So she had to
Yeah.
give herself permission to go there. But once she did, it's a pattern that just keeps growing.
Yeah, and so I call this process of learning putting tools in your treasure chest, because those tools are always available to you to pull out, dust off anytime something else disrupts things, and they make you think, it's like a what just happened? And then the emotions come up, and then you realize, you know what? I've been here before. Not exactly in the same way, but I know what to do. I know that I'm evolving. I know that my values might be changing, my priorities might be shifting, things in my life might be changing, but I know what to do.
I love the
That's
treasure chest. I have an image in my brain already. I love it.
Yeah, and we get to open that up at any point in time and dust off those tools. All right, so we're talking about disruption. Something comes to mind. One of the biggest disruptions that was global, the pandemic, right? We all felt disrupted by that for a couple of years, and there's an aftermath that comes with that. But I'd love to know how you see it. What is different about your lens into disruption?
I thank you for bringing up the pandemic because I think so many of us have been living with it kind of as this uber presence for so long. It's important to use it in conversation because we all have an experience, right? It's a common experience for all of us. And I think it's interesting. Early in my research, I interviewed two people, both of whom lost their jobs in the early days of the pandemic. And they were both kind of managers at Macy's, which all may know is a retail chain in the United States. And one of the managers, said, "Yeah, I lost my job. I'm working hard to, replace my income. All good. This is hard. It was unexpected, but I'm all there." And then her colleague, also who lost his job during the early days of the pandemic, said, I'm having trouble resetting, right? That, being a manager at Macy's was so much a part of my identity. He's like, look, I'm not entirely defined by my work or the accomplishments I've had in the workplace. He said, but this is a big shift for me. And I'm having a hard time, given all these other things that are changing, figuring out what to do. And Maria, I love those two side by side examples because they're both in the pandemic, right? They both had nearly identical jobs. And yet they reacted very differently. And it brings up two additional vocabulary words that I use a lot in the book that I think might be interesting for us to put into this conversation. And those two words are change and transition. Because in a moment of disruption, we can respond in 1,000 ways, right? We can cling to the status quo. We can retreat to, behaviors that were successful for us as an earlier time, or we can change or transition. And I'm oversimplifying it, but those four are generally the buckets. And changes when we're in the face of a disruption have to do with maintaining our self concept, right? We have a static self concept when we choose change in the face of disruption. We make variations and alterations, right? But we're not really changing our thinking about who we are. Transition is very different in the face of a disruption. Transitions allow us to recognize that there's a shift in our thinking about who we are and how we make meaning in the world. And we welcome instability in that self concept for a time. So, changes or alterations or variations on a static self concept, whereas transitions honor this notion that there's a shift in what holds value or meaning to us. And we make activities in concert with this notion that we are welcoming instability for a time, but we're re-examining the assumptions upon which we anchor our self-concept. And in that re-examination, there are some things that we may toss away and say, you know what, it's outlived its useful life. But there are other things we may turn up the volume on or welcome new. So it's a very fluid state when we say, I need to respond to a situation like a pandemic, right? There are some who will say, yep, I've got a lot to do. This is hard. I'm going to be, resilient, but I'm maintaining my sense of self, right? I'm maintaining a static self concept. And there are others who, in the face of a transition, are going to be like, this might be an important time to reevaluate because I can see that there is a shift in some things that hold value and meaning to me, and this is important, and I want to honor it. So I think the pandemic was this universal experience, but it also allows us to shine a bright light on two different vocabulary words that I'm really introducing in a new way, or I think in society we learn to use those words interchangeably, right? So
Yeah.
I'm asking us to consider a new way of thinking about these common vocabulary words in the book, because what they do is they set us up for this notion that transitions can be an entree to growth.
Transition can be an entree to growth. Yeah, that's that's an interesting way to put it. My reaction is the growth happens during that transition period. It starts happening there. But I think sometimes the recognition of our growth happens after.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Yeah. It's
Um,
like, oh, I came this far? Really? Look how much I've changed or shifted.
you
You're
know,
talking. Go ahead.
oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I, you, as I was listening to you talk just then, it was about responding differently, right? And I read so many fabulous stories, and I know that you've done such a ton of research for both of your books. But which of those stories brings home this idea of responding differently?
I think there's one that I love, and it's about Lakshmi. And she is this really very lovely woman who she's in her early 30s. And she's very capable young woman. And she had been studying in an MD, PhD program at a Big Ten university and was on a track to be, a gifted academic researcher. And she, had a specialty in some biomedical fields. And she said, all of a sudden I came to this realization that this isn't who I want to be. And it was crushing, right? Because she said, I've never even dreamed outside of this, right? Here she is, I think she was 34. Ever since she was a little girl, this was what she was going to become. And and I'll say two things about that, right? One is she learned early on that that's what got, her being kind of a smart person and reaching towards this goal was what got responded to. And she was terrified that if she took that away, she wasn't sure what her connection to others was going to be about. And the other thing that I think was so fascinating is that she was also someone who was very physically fit and she was very self-aware. And she said, I ignored my instincts for a long time on this, right? I knew that it was kind of losing its luster, she said, but the adrenaline and being a part of this fast-paced environment, helped me keep going. But she said, I started to get these debilitating headaches. And she said, the pain was so intense. She said, I started to ask myself, what does my body know that I don't know yet? And that led her on this course of really trying to open up the question she was willing to ask herself. And with the new vocabulary, thinking about change and transition, she got to this notion of recognizing that she was in this period of re-examining her sense of self, right? Was she going to be an MD, PhD, or was she going to be something that could leverage those skills but express them in a different way? And I think so to answer your question, Maria, the first thing in responding differently is asking ourselves new questions. And and that can be hard, but much easier if we bring a new lens, right? New vocabulary, new ways of understanding what's happening. And what ultimately happened is Lakshmi began to um, reach into new ways to use her talents. For a period of time, she joined an AmeriCorps program and taught some science in the public schools. It wasn't like a dream job for her. It was a first step to allow her to catch her breath outside of what was a increasingly physically debilitating environment. And from that, it was fascinating because she recognized that that was one of many small steps, right? There's a step, another step, another step, another step. We keep making small steps in the direction of what we think is correct as we begin a transition. And ultimately said, she related some comments that some new colleagues of her said about her. She said, I'm thought of as a leader and that I'm funny. And she said, this is startling to me because I never thought of these characteristics, let alone thought that I could express them and be thought of in this way. And so, Maria, I love her story because she's representative of many stories in the book, right? She had a crushing realization. She began to ask herself new questions. She used the information in the book to help her move and take a step and then another step, right? Some people believe that when we make these decisions, it's like one swing of the bat and all of a
Yeah.
sudden we're deposited in a new place. When in fact, my research reveals that it's really an iterative process that's informed by a growing awareness of what holds value and meaning to us. And that process is what gets us to places, that Lakshmi landed, which said, she's startled. That was her word. I'm startled by what I've learned. And ultimately she also expressed something that I think is very, very important in transition. We get to know ourselves through connections with others, right? She really got to test out her new expression of who she was in front of other people, a community that allowed her to kind of add oxygen to her wonderful skills. And through that, she learned about who she was in an entirely new way.
Yeah. I think hers is one of my favorite stories because I hear this often. I started my own corporate career because it was what I thought I was supposed to do. I was living up to other people's expectations of me, and I think we a lot of us do that for way too long, and then we find ourselves in a situation like Lakshmi, where it something did not feel right, and she was brave enough, and it does take courage to take a new look at this and to just kind of throw everything up in the air and go, what questions do I need to ask myself that are different than I've ever asked myself before that might put a new spin on this for me? Love
It
that.
is it is it is incredible, and, she you pick up on something, Maria, which is, reflective of your deep wisdom on this topic, because um, she recognized that at a point in her life, this identity that she had fostered and added to and cultivated for so long was really rooted in some expectations she had adopted from those around her.
Right, right.
And that is a very common way we
It is.
all enter adulthood, right? So for your
Absolutely.
right, for
Yes.
your listeners, right? When we enter adulthood, the way we form our identity or our self-concept is that we draw on definitions and expectations around us. So It's made up of our religious affiliations, our families, the communities we live in, the education we've gotten, the occupation we choose, right? When we create an identity in our early adulthood, we're pulling from all of these places to form this trial balloon, right? This cohesion. And we're almost it's called a provisional identity if we want to get really academic, right? So we test this provisional identity. And since we've drawn it from our external environment, we get affirmed on this,
Yeah.
right? Because everyone's like, oh, high five, Maria. Yep, you're doing the exact great thing. You're wonderful, right? Because what we're doing is we're creating this composite based on little fragments we've adopted from around us.
Right.
And
Right.
when we go, like Lakshmi went through a radical, she calls it a radical transformation, right? Because so much of who she was changing. When we go through these transformations, right? What we're doing is we're re-examining the assumptions that we use to define ourselves. And we say, you know what? I
Yeah.
picked up that one and that one doesn't fit anymore. I'm going to put that on
Right.
the back burner.
Right.
And
Right.
it's this process of really, this lovely researcher from California, her name is Ravenna Helson. She's about 92 now. She's a lovely lady. She worked at UC Berkeley for many years. She called this process a recentering, right? Where
Ah,
we take these assumptions that we've held for so long and we say, you know what, that one's kind of pulling us off kilter. We're going to let that one go and we're going to bring up the volume on this other one or make some space for this new one. And this recentering is really this lovely transformative process that is open to all of us. But as you said, Maria, it takes courage,
it
and I
does.
think from my side, we need to educate. If we educate ourselves on what's actually happening, it takes less courage because it isn't so scary once we understand what's going on.
That's so true. That is so true. I love the phrase that you used a moment ago. Give oxygen to. That conjures such a great image for me because it's putting air around new ideas and new ways of thinking that allow you to hold it up and look at it differently than you've ever looked at it before. And so often you mentioned this question. I get the most common question I get from that women are asking themselves uh, from my clients is, who am I now? Who am I now that things are changing? Who am I now that this happened? Right? Who who am I now in your terms? Who am I now that my life has been disrupted?
And it in and of itself is a courageous question, right? So
Yeah,
let's honor the fact that it's a lot of people have that question in their heart and
yeah,
still believe they need to hold on to external images of success, like, oh, everything's fine. When
yeah.
in fact, inside, it's like, wait a minute, who am I now? So the first note is that it takes a lot to ask that question, but those who have that courage can positively alter their lives.
Right.
Absolutely, right? Because that question is the beginning of this wonderful process where we're re-examining the expectations we hold for ourselves. We're learning to think about our identity and our connections to others in a new way. And we're
Right.
learning to reframe how we hold on to our emotions through the process.
And reframe the things that we have believed for so long, right? And the values that we may have held in the former situation, right? So I think it does take courage and a willingness to take it, and you said this earlier, step by step. It is. I love the metaphors you use. Always bring up great pictures in my mind. You said, it's not one swing of the bat, and you've transformed.
You
It
know,
is a process that takes time, and it takes commitment, and it takes curiosity, and it
and
takes courage, but
and
it is so doable.
yeah, and Maria, I was so wrong, I think, in the beginning, what I thought this process would be for me. I thought it would get me a new job or, take me to a new place, right? When what it has done is it allows me to see everything in a new way.
Yeah.
And that sounds so subtle, but maybe I can try with your help to really bring some tangible ideas to that. You know, um, there was a woman who participated in the research who said, she went through a unexpected divorce and was really just crushed. And she said, my whole life I never believed that I would be anything other than a mother and a family person, and this has really rocked my belief in who I am. And yet
Mm.
once she got through the transition, it was as if she's like, I didn't really have to leave anything to affect what this transition is. This is about a recentering of my values. Like, is this, yes, those things are important to me, but I've learned to be right in my same space and see things differently, right? It is important to me to be present in my children's life, to be very active in my community, to be a vital part of the family. None of those things are excluded because I had the event of my divorce, right? That was a something that I had to go through. And so she really started to believe that her transition wasn't about leaving her marriage. What it was coming into her own
Your own.
thinking in a new way.
Yeah.
And I think it took her, to your point earlier, it took her to go through the divorce to really understand that it wasn't really about the relationship with with her former spouse. It was about her relationship with herself, and then how she could bring herself to everything around her, to what was in her orbit. And
Right.
because of her willingness to kind of embrace transition, ask herself new questions, she could do that in an entirely different way.
Yeah. I love what you just said. And this is the case every time, I believe. And I think based on my reading of your two books, I think it's proven out through your research that it is only about us and how we respond to whatever is happening around us. And it's our choice to look at it differently or not, right? To evaluate or reevaluate or not. It's always about recentering. It's a great word, right? Recentering around who we want to be, who we want to become if we're not there yet, instead of who we were.
This choice, thank you for bringing it up, Maria. Choice is such a fundamental component to
Yeah.
this progression. And, so many people came into my research and said, what choice did I have? My spouse died. I lost my job. There was a series of circumstances that they felt left them no other option.
Right.
And what I learned in the research and what you're referencing is that even within all of that, we have the choice of how we respond.
Yes.
And the work that I do really tries to inform people so that we can make a choice of how best to respond.
Yeah.
And and ideally we respond through clarity and alignment with the things that hold value and meaning to us. And I think that is an enormous invitation
Yeah.
that takes work.
Yep. It does. There's no um, switch to flip, to turn something on that was off or off that was on. It just doesn't work that way. It does take work. So to that point, I want you to get to that really cool and extensively tested emotional reframing technique that you call HAIL and that you share in your book. Would you please explain to us what that is and how it can be useful?
Yes, and so thank you so much for asking about it because it is one of four methods that I introduce to help people who are navigating major transitions. And HAIL is a four-part acronym, or excuse a four-part process that every one of the letters of HAIL, HAIL, stands for a step that we do. And ultimately, it is trying to help us diffuse the power that emotions have over us, right? And I use the concept of reframing, and reframing is a funny word. We hear it a lot, but I always think of it, Maria. It's as if I invited you to come out onto the street, and then I asked you to draw the skyscraper that was right in front of us. And then I said, "Oh, come this way." And you and I took the elevator in the building across the street and went up onto the roof deck. And I said, "Okay, Maria, now I want you to draw that same building, but from this vantage point," right? So the 4 steps in HALE help us see emotions from a totally different angle. And that is incredibly powerful when we're navigating a transition, because at those times, oppositional emotions like regret, shame, self-doubt, sadness, fear, and 1,000 others, um, even perfectionism, frankly, I heard that an awful lot. Um, all of those emotions mobilize to serve as barriers for us moving forward. And so, what I teach in the book is this technique so that people can be different with those emotions. Right. One of them that's active for me a lot when I'm navigating this is sadness. And I often describe it, that without HALE, it's as if I'm holding onto the end of a rope. And on any day, sadness can appear and like flick me around willy nilly, depending on whatever its desires are that day. But I'm, doing my best just to hold on those days. But if I use HALE, what happens is it's as if I can drop that rope on the ground next to me, right? Sadness is still there, but I've completely diffused its ability to have power over me, right? It can't whip me around willy-nilly. It's there. I don't dishonor it. I don't ignore it. I don't try to bypass it. I don't manage it. It's present, but its ability to be over me and to take over my day is totally gone. And so HALE is a very important technique, right? Because as we're going through, this transition that Lakshmi was talking about, right? Debilitating, terrifying. She never even thought of herself outside of this concept of being an MD PhD. As she stepped away, it was life shattering. It was terrifying at every level. And we began to just use this notion of HALE, which would help her, just like the skyscraper, like, okay, I can see terror and I can see it, but now I see it from a different angle. And working with the technique over and over again helps us do that. And it helps us take that sadness, like I described, drop it on the ground and keep going. And that's the critical thing is we need to keep taking those steps, right? The step, the next step, the next step. And if we don't have a new technique to handle the oppositional emotions that come, we can get sidetracked for days, months,
Right.
decades, woo, going off
Yep.
instead of really continuing to make progress. And so I love HALE because HALE is a very simple, practical tool that everyone can use. And I've tested it, through my formal research, and I use it all the time in my work now. And I train coaches on it. Like, it is a very substantial tool, and it's one that always, always generates enormous new thinking.
Yeah, and it's powerful. Just the way you explained those two scenarios you explained, the different, the seeing the building from a different perspective. That reminds me of my very favorite quote by Wayne Dyer: "When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change." And that
Yes.
is so, so true. And then the rope, just dropping the rope, just dropping the sadness doesn't mean it doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
But the fact that it no longer, you've just taken its power away by dropping it instead of holding on for dear life. And like you said, flipping you around willy nilly. You reminded me so much of my Massachusetts roots when you said that. My mom used to say that all the time, willy nilly. But yeah, so it powerful, powerful tools, more tools for your treasure chest. And the more tools you have, the more they can help you and the more you'll have as resources. So depending on what the circumstances are, something that you learn in HALE may help you. All right. So, Linda, there's one last story I can't wait for you to tell. I don't want to give away all of the great stuff in your book, but there's this one story that is really powerful. It I sat up and took notice of this one. It's about the sightless man. And I think he said something like, he sees more now. Would you tell us that story?
Yeah, actually have tears in my eyes, Maria, even thinking about it. He was such an incredible person.
Yeah.
And I asked him, as I did everyone, right? I have audio tapes of all these conversations, and we sat down and I asked him to describe, his transformation or his transition. And he said, um, I see so much more now. And I was somewhat speechless when he said that, because I was sitting next to a man who had not seen one thing in more than a decade. And I was so struck by that, because here was a man who had, over a decade, in his late 30s, he had lost his sight to a degenerative eye condition. And he said, in the beginning, I made changes, right? I clung on to a self concept that was operating as a person in the sighted world. And I kept taking things away. I stayed in more. I took this away, that away, became lesser. But my self concept, I still viewed myself as a sighted individual, but with some deficits. He said, ultimately, what I realized, that this had nothing to do with my sight. This whole process had to do with how I see myself and the value that I bring to this world. And he said, it's been life changing. And he doesn't believe that his diagnosis and his sight impairment is really what his transition was about. It was really about him. And he goes on to tell an incredibly riveting story that talks about how he shifted from being in a deficit situation to one of unbounded growth. And I remember when we were finishing our talk, he sat next to me and he said, I don't know what you look like. I have no idea what you're wearing. He said, but I see people in ways that I never imagined. And so, Maria, I can't say more other than to ask people to go to their local library or choose the book somewhere, um, that they buy books or audiobooks. But it is
Yeah.
it is one of the most powerful exchanges I've ever been in, and I'm delighted to share with it people on the page what would
Yeah.
happen. And I'm happy to note that you grabbed it, because that means I must have told the story at least in a decent way.
Oh, yeah, it's powerful. I loved that story. There's so many stories to love. And, by the way, there will be a link to get Linda's book in the show notes. So don't go looking too far, because we're going to drop it right there for you. Linda, we have so much more to talk about. You and I have already talked about this. We're going to bring you back. We're going to do, another very different conversation, I am sure, because there's so much good stuff in your research and in this book, and in your previous book as well, Women and Transition. But before we wrap up here, I'd love for you to just kind of put a bow around this for us. Share with us some key takeaways that the people watching can just kind of latch onto and go, "Oh, I haven't thought about it that way," or I could try that. Give us some, we call this show Tips for the Transition for a
Yes.
reason. So what
Yes,
do
so
we
I
got?
thought of two. I thought of two maybe that we could share, right? The first is,
Okay.
I invite you to think differently about these moments when it seems like, the world is coming upended, undone, or you're questioning in a major way, who am I? I invite you to consider that these times are invitations for growth, and ask yourself, what might that growth be about? Curious, right? Turn your curiosity to yourself. That would be my first tip, right? And
Okay.
I admit, at those times it's really hard. Believe me, I've been through my own very wrenching transition, so I get it. But just, play for a minute and turn that curiosity as to what might be. If this is happening ultimately as the beginning of opening up a new path, a yellow brick road, what might that be about? I invite you to entertain it as an invitation. And the second thing I would say is, see if you can't honor the emotions that are coming up, right? Because, by the way, if you're in this spot, you're going to have plenty of emotions. And when I say honor, take a moment, use your phone's, record button, or write them down, or make a mental note, and just honor the emotions. Hey, welcome anxiety, hello regret, welcome back perfectionism, whatever they are. Because as we welcome emotions, right, we acknowledge, we name them, we give them a name, we value them in a way that is unusual, and we begin the process of diffusing their emotions over us, right? All of a sudden, the emotions are the emotions. We are not the emotion, right? They're not a character trait, they're an impermanent state. And so, do yourself a favor by taking that first step. And I invite you to take many more steps if you have time to get the book. But take that first step and just name the emotions that are present. Because I think even in that, you'll feel the power begin to shift.
That is that's so true when you just honor, what it is, and just say, "I know you're here to help me. I know you're here for a reason,"
Right.
and then be curious about what the
Right.
reason is.
Right.
So those two go so well hand in hand. Linda, thank you so much. I know there's
Maria,
a lot of people who are going to want to get in touch with you and learn more about you. What is the one best way they can do that?
the easiest, simplest way is to go onto LinkedIn and message me there. It's the easiest way. And I'm always honored to say hello. I'm happy to be a resource or help in any way. And Maria, I can't thank you enough for creating the space for this conversation because it's been a pure delight.
Thank you. It is I who am honored to have you here. I love your book, and I am just loving you even more having had this conversation. So I look forward to the next time that we can do this again.
I do as well.
Great. All right. So everyone, for thank you so much for staying with us, for watching, listening. I appreciate that you're a part of this community. And if you enjoyed this episode, as I said before, please subscribe or comment or click a star, whatever, to tell us what you thought. As I said at the top of the show as well, I love creating and sharing resources for women. Plus, as a career and life coach, I work with women to help them navigate challenging times more quickly and effectively. So, if something in this episode resonates with you and you'd like a fresh perspective, remember we talked about perspective today, please continue the conversation with me in the Career Transition Roadmap private Facebook group. I would be delighted to, and if you have any questions for Linda, I'll be sure to pull her in to answer them. So join us there. And then let's meet again here next Wednesday, same time, same place. Because you know what? I believe it's our time to thrive. So let's thrive together. Till next time, I'm Maria Tomas Keegan, helping you turn transition into triumph.